meeting this afternoon. As you know, it's our practice to record these briefing meetings, so I hope that it's all right for everybody. As is fitting for the eve of St. Patrick's Day, the topic of this afternoon's briefing is a faith perspective on Ireland post-Brexit. And we're very pleased to welcome our two distinguished guests this afternoon who are going to be speaking to us. I'll introduce now our first speaker. Donal McKeown has been Bishop of Derry, Catholic Bishop of Derry since 2014. Prior to that, he was Auxiliary Bishop in the Diocese of Down and Connor from 2001, following a very distinguished career as a priest within the Catholic Church in Ireland. Bishop Donal, it's very good for you to be with us this afternoon, and we'll hand over to you now, and you are able to share your screen. So welcome, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope Stephen and I don't require subtitles. We'll try our best to speak in a way you understand. I'm only joking. Okay. Share. These are just a number of general slides that I hope will give us some context. Can you see something?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. From the beginning. Okay. Yes, I taught in schools for many years, as maybe some of you might be aware, 23 years as school teacher and school principal. And I always worked on the basis that with young people, it was better to be, I think as Chesterton said, always better to be unhappy with the right questions than happy with the wrong answers. So I'm just sort of hoping that this afternoon may help us at least to ensure we're asking the right questions about the state of the churches in Ireland, Christianity in Ireland, and the direction we're going. I suppose I was asked to give a talk to a German group just last May out in the continent on divided islands, Ireland, Brexit, and the EU. So I've sort of been wrestling with some points from that over this past number of months. But I suppose the first point I started off with in terms of divided islands, is that the United Kingdom is a strange country because you have 4 international soccer teams, 3 and a bit international rugby teams. And there are people who would be cheering for Northern Ireland if they were playing against the Republic in soccer, would be cheering for Ireland if they were playing against England in rugby. And there are people who can represent Ireland in athletics, but also will represent Northern Ireland when it comes to the Commonwealth Games. So I think we live with the experience of being divided in many sorts of ways. There's been a big division on the island of Ireland, I suppose, really since the time of the Reformation and all that came with that. And it's one of those realities that I live with here, and Stephen's not too far away either. I'm 2 miles from the border of the UK and Ireland, Republic of Ireland, the border of the UK and the EU. Our local soccer team, Derry City, for various historical reasons, plays in the League of Ireland, and they won the Irish Cup last year. And when it came to the President's Shield or Cup, whatever it was, about 3 weeks ago, the Irish president was in Derry, and the only national anthem played was the Irish national anthem. So Derry City play in the League of Ireland. And about a fortnight ago, I was at another match in the neighbouring stadium between Derry and Dublin in Gaelic football. And of course, the only national anthem played there was the Irish national anthem. And we live with that reality that all our churches are cross-border, Methodist, Presbyterian, Church of Ireland, and Catholic. 2 systems of government and education, 2 currencies, 2 sets of regulations. It may be required for foreign visitors over the next number of months to get an ISA, to get some sort of permission to cross the border if they land in Dublin and want to visit Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, to get some sort of a visa to cross, or at least a permit to cross and visit Northern Ireland. And it's much more complex, obviously, since Brexit, to have residence in Northern Ireland. So yes, division is something that we've lived with for many hundreds of years, and we have found various ways of coping with it. Just a number of other things about even the names that we have. For example, as you can see, this city is officially called Londonderry, but the overwhelming majority of residents call it Derry or Derry, the Irish one, the Oak Grove. And then we sort of laugh and say Derry, Londonderry, legendary. Let's make a joke about the whole thing. The local council is Derry City and Strabane District Council. That's its official name. We have City of Derry Airport. One of the strong loyalist organizations is the Apprentice Boys of Derry. I'm the Bishop of the Derry Diocese of Derry, which is cross-border, Party Donegal. My Anglican counterpart, Andrew Forster, Andrew is Bishop of Derry and Raphoe, so he goes much further into the Republic than I do. Our local radio, in order not to have a name that causes problems, takes the name of the river, the Radio Foyle. Or we talk about the Maiden City, the city that was never ravished by those who assailed it. So we find ways of playing with our identities, find names that don't cause too much trouble, too much difficulty for people. How did we handle those in the 20th century? Well, with the partitioning of Ireland, or the South, whatever you want to call it, going independent in 1922, we ended up really with an island that was divided, yes, primarily you would say on religious terms, Catholic dominated republic, and then what was called by someone in North a Protestant state for a Protestant people. That may be an unfair use of a phrase, but it was used by a senior politician. And I suppose the churches, in many ways, when it came to the explosion of tensions within Northern Ireland between the majority who saw themselves as Irish rather than British, and the majority who felt very threatened by what was seen as a disloyal minority, we were ill prepared for the challenge and the anger that blew up in 1968 and so on. And obviously the role of the churches has been affected seriously by the whole child abuse thing, institutional abuse, all of that. Sort of as a slight aside, somebody gave me a great theology or a great paradigm many years ago. He said, in every conflict there are three theologies. And he says theologies. These are theologies. They're not just theories. He said there's the status quo theology coming from a faith perspective. Let's get all those bad people who do terrible things and put them in prison, and then we can all get back to the nice little country we used to have. That sort of that status quo theology. Then he said there's also the reconciliation theology, which he says, get all those children and people from poor areas who seem to be doing so much fighting, get them away somewhere or other on holidays together, or put them in schools together, and they get to know each other, and then they'll stop annoying us nice people. I caricature. But in other words, it really is the fault of those who are doing the fighting for whatever reason. Get them to, it's all born of ignorance. But then this guy, who's from Presbyterian background, said there's also the prophetic theology, as he called it, which asks not so much in every conflict who's fighting, but who's benefiting from the fighting going on. We can ask it about Ukraine. We can ask it about Israel and Palestine. We can ask it about absolutely anywhere, not just who's doing the fighting. So his comment was, yes, it doesn't, you don't neglect the status quo theology of ensuring that those who do crimes have to pay for it. You don't avoid the reconciliation agenda. Of course you don't. But he says you end up blaming the wrong people if you avoid asking the awkward questions of the powerful. Who in every conflict does it suit that the conflict continues? So that's sort of part of where I'm coming from. And we've had all sorts of attempts down through the decades to try and find a way of balancing diversity of identities here. And obviously religion has played an important role as sort of a marker. But when it came then to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, whose Silver Jubilee we celebrate this year, it was ultimately quite clear in the Good Friday Agreement solution that this was all about identity and nothing about theology. In other words, as you know, the Good Friday Agreement had the three strands to it with no reference to religion. It was about the totality of relationships. I think, John, you can use that phrase a lot. It was the internal relationships within Northern Ireland. And obviously you had the Stormont Assembly put in place and all parties in government at that stage. You have the north-south relationship. So you have a variety of north-south bodies to do with waterways and tourism and so on. So encouraging that sort of all island identity, even within two jurisdictions. And then you have the east-west dimension, which recognizes that ultimately the division here is between Britishness and Irishness, even if the Westminster government down through the decades tended to say it's those Catholics and Protestants over there fighting one another, and we, good army, are there trying to bring the peace and costing ourselves an absolute fortune. The Good Friday Agreement certainly suggests that the IRA wasn't fighting for the glory of the Pope or the victory of Thomistic theology. That was never on their agenda. Okay. So the whole Good Friday Agreement was to get a balance of those three identities. I suppose the weakness of the Good Friday Agreement that we have seen is that there was an expectation, obviously I think a poorly based expectation, that the middle ground would coalesce within Northern Ireland. In other words, the SDLP and the official unionists. But that probably didn't recognise that the basic problem was a lack of agreement about the political unit called Northern Ireland. Is it Irish? Is it British? Should it be Irish? Should it be British? And therefore, for those who said that Northern Ireland shouldn't remain British, making Northern Ireland work wasn't really an option. There wasn't, as there had to be in South Africa, an agreed allegiance to a unitary state. South Africa had to find a way of working and living with itself. The whole problem with the Northern Ireland struggle, the Troubles and so on, it seems to me, really was between those who thought that Northern Ireland needed to belong to the UK in order to survive, to thrive, and those who thought Northern Ireland could never work within the UK in the long term. Therefore, we've ended up with tribal politics, where every issue, whether it be Brexit or the protocol, simply becomes a weapon in a bigger agenda. Keep Northern Ireland British, unite Ireland. So those two big agendas are going on. And in the political world, you need to have tribes vote for you. And therefore, there's an inherent problem in the Good Friday Agreement that it didn't resolve, it didn't solve. That's certainly what it seems to me. And the problem is we're still living out of that victory paradigm. Somebody's got to win here. Either those who keep Northern Ireland in the UK or those who unite Northern Ireland with the Republic. So it's ultimately a victory paradigm we're working on. That means that reconciliation means different things depending on what your macro agenda is, if that makes any sense. In terms of religious affiliation, yes, it's been useful for tribal purposes. And that's experienced differently within the two sort of main traditions, the Catholic tradition and the Reformed tradition. It's been useful in the sense that my home village of Randallstown, let's say 4,000 or 5,000 people, half and half, would have one Catholic parish and 8 other churches. And events, it seems to us, from my perspective, events like the 12th of July, the Orange Men's March, in some way it's the only opportunity for those who see themselves as being from a unionist perspective to come together under the one umbrella, because certainly in local communities there would be a level of competition for membership. There certainly were during the Troubles great religious figures who sought to bring peace. Harold Good and Alec Reid and so on were made big figures. But institutionally, the churches, I think, made less of a contribution in terms of solving the problem of violence. But now we're living that reality of the churches having a huge loss of power, and we have to find ways of living with that. Ultimately, we have to live with weakness and humility. Strangely, just as Jesus had to, surprisingly enough. We have to expect rejection. On the other hand, the positive side of that is that ultimately the church is worth attacking. Otherwise, if we didn't have something that we were saying that was awkward for some members of our society, particularly among the strong, then I think we wouldn't be attacked. So we have to find a new reality, a new way of being church. We can end up analysing ourselves from now until the cows come home. But there's a quotation from Pope Benedict XVI that I liked some years ago. We can end up seeing everything as loss, but Christianity isn't a collection of prohibitions. It's a positive option. It's very important that we look at it again, because this idea almost completely disappeared. We've heard so much about what is not allowed that now it's time to say we have a positive idea to offer. We're not there to defend something, we're there to try and proclaim something. Okay. And when it comes to some sort of role for the churches, I think certainly the churches working together, as we've done so very well, is really trying to be a prophetic voice in the changed environment. In other words, asking the awkward questions about why are young people so broken? What is it we're doing so terribly wrong? It's creating so much dysfunctionality. And the bottom half of that slide there is taken from the Irish Times shortly after Christmas. Astronomical number of young people are self-harming, psychiatrists say. I think we as churches are now the new, where we can take on the role of being the new prophetic voice, asking awkward questions of those who are in power. Can we be the new dissenting voice, the new prophetic voice, calling society to be better than it actually is, rather than carping at it for breaking our rules? An article in the Observer, it must be about 10 years ago, that somebody came to look at the role of the churches in the Republic, but they wrote, "You develop the sense that in a country where dissent has been neutered by amoral postmodern politics and consensual endorsement of greed and vainglory by all political parties, these people, referring to the Catholic Church in the Republic, despite what is seen as their doctrinal orthodoxy, have become, with their moral code, for their own reasons and by secular default, the real opposition." And I sort of found that an encouraging sort of approach for us to be able to take. How can we actually be the prophetic voice, the loyal opposition, telling our society, no, we can be better? But the big challenge for us as churches in the North, when we are much weaker than we used to be in terms of allegiance, and end up getting blamed for almost everything in the past by those who'd want to have a new secular orthodoxy coming through. We have to make a contribution to something that affects all of society. How do we deal with the past? That's difficult. How does Germany deal with the Second World War? How do Western powers deal with the legacy of colonialism? How do we deal with the legacy of the Troubles? And deep down, it's not just about individuals finding reconciliation with their past. Again, there's the tribal politics of fighting over the narrative. There's the IRA Republican narrative that says this was a rebellion by an oppressed minority against an oppressive state. And there's an element of truth in that. There's the other narrative coming from unionism and loyalism. We had a state that worked remarkably well and was attacked by a murderous band who did most of the killing. And there's an element of truth in that. And then there would be, I think, the Westminster narrative that would tend to sort of say, this was a fight in Ireland and we were only there trying to bring peace. And there's not an awful lot of truth in that. But drawing a line under the past, as the current legacy bill suggests, is popular with none of the victims' bodies, the victims' groups, right across the spectrum. It's reasonably popular with all those who were competent, who would like to draw a line under the past and say, let's move on. But certainly, the narrative is the important thing. And I think the challenge for us as churches is to see how can we create a truer truth about the past, a more shared narrative about what happened. Now, when you can end up fighting over somebody being shot in the face with a rubber bullet 50 years ago, and you can end up being Richard Moore, who's set up a charity and has no bitterness in him at all, being blinded at the age of 10, and we got somebody else in the news today harping and complaining that his brother was killed 50 years ago, and he has to find some sort of success, some sort of peace only through a public inquiry. So how can we build relationships, and how can we have shared witness in an otherwise divided society? And how can we do that in the face of an aggressive secularism that ultimately wants to keep the Christian voice out of everything? And I think together we're discovering the advantage of being a minority. What have we been doing in this city? Derry, Londonderry, legendary, whatever you want to call it. In some ways, Derry was at the beginning of the Troubles. They erupted here in 1968, 69. But really from the 80s onwards, when the politicians wouldn't even sit in the same building together, we had the Churches Trust set up here in the city, which was the four main churches working together on social issues, way ahead of the pack. We had the Inner City Trust from the 70s, where the two bishops, the Anglican and the Catholic, set up the Inner City Trust, took buildings that were damaged in bomb attacks and said, we will buy over the derelict buildings. We will get funds to rebuild them. Go on, bomb them again. Go on, try it. So in many ways here, the churches have been, in the city certainly, way ahead of other parts of Northern Ireland in terms of trying to find a solution. We had a good example of those relationships on the day the Savile report came out, where it was clearly stated by Lord Savile that all those who were shot dead on Bloody Sunday were unarmed, innocent civilians. And the following day, the local Church of Ireland Bishop, Norman Hamilton, well, the Presbyterian Church, and I forget who it was for the Methodist, because I wasn't here, Stephen, came down to Free Derry Corner by arrangement to meet the families of those who'd been killed. And they said, we are just so happy for you that your relations 50 or 40 years on have been found to be innocent, something you've insisted on from the first. So relationships here in this city are remarkably good. I have down there at the bottom of that slide, the Irish Churches Peace Project. We had a 3-year project funded from the European money to equip our parishes to engage better with difficult questions of reconciliation. I chaired that. I don't know how successful it's been, but I think it's a very incremental process of how we ensure that relationships are built that enable us to engage with the difficult questions of the past. I'm coming to my last slide. Education, like everything else, is remarkably divided. And all we ask is, how do we, where schools are traditionally linked with denominations, in other words, there's a lot of 45% of the schools are Catholic schools. Most of the state schools are called controlled schools. They were handed over by the Protestant churches to the state at the beginning of Northern Ireland. And the Protestant transferring churches have the rights of representation on board of governors and so on. So how do we actually find a way to ensure education reflects diversity and yet builds some sort of cohesiveness in the context of tribal politics? Do we want integrated schools as the only solution, or do we want an integration of our school system? And I'd suggest that we have the latter very much in Derry, with a range of schools all actively working together in a remarkably successful model, rather than saying all schools must be integrated, whatever that means. How do we celebrate diversity and maintain cohesiveness? That's what you have in GB, a range of schools all working within a remarkably cohesive system. How do you do all that while tribal politics continue? I'll maybe stop at that stage. And I hope I've left you suitably confused, because anybody who thinks they understand the problem in Northern Ireland clearly doesn't. Thank you.
Ashley, are you with us? I think he's had some connectivity issues. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bishop McKeown. Thank you very, very much. I think that we'll hear from our second speaker now. I'm hoping that Ashley can come back.
Yes, I'm here now. Yeah. I'm here now. It's great to be able to welcome Stephen Skuce, who's been the Superintendent for the Northwest District of the Methodist Church in Ireland since 2019, after a distinguished career in the Methodist Church in Ireland and also working in Sri Lanka. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps the first thing I would say is I've agreed with absolutely everything that Donal has shared. Now, maybe that isn't a surprise, but Christianity in Ireland, you get a Protestant and a Catholic to speak about the issue. You're probably, at one stage, people would have anticipated, okay, we're going to hear two very distinctive views here, have a bit of a ding dust, and let's see where it goes to. That's not the case. I think I could say that everything. I was trying to find. There must be something I can disagree with Donal on here. No, I don't think I could. So I won't repeat what Donal has shared. Let me just try and sort of give a few other areas around it. So we're asked to talk particularly about post-Brexit. Bear in mind, in the north of Ireland, we are not post-Brexit. We are still in the middle of the Brexit debate. And as we know, the Brexit debate is all about English nationalism. It's not about anything else. It's about English nationalism. And we in Ireland are once more victims of a dispute. If you want to go back to our problems with King Billy and so on, that was a European war fought on Ireland, of which we were bearing the consequences still today. As I understand it, Brexit was an English nationalist argument, of which who is paying the price today? Well, I think, frankly, everyone in the United Kingdom is paying the price for it, or certainly the economic price for it, but particularly in Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland. And for those who are from this part of the world, there's a world of difference in using the phrase Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland. And sometimes I've said it not the way I meant to, given the context I was in. So yeah. So we're not post-Brexit. We're still in the middle of Brexit. We currently have no working Northern Ireland democracy, i.e. our local assembly has not been able to meet because one political party, because of issues to do with Brexit, but to be honest, it's a little bit more existential than that, are refusing to be part of it. And at the same time, that was if and when we do return, it'll be for the first time in the history of the Northern Irish state, it will be a nationalist will be our first minister or prime minister or whatever. And lo and behold, the main unionist party have found a reason not to have democracy continuing. Maybe it's just a huge coincidence, or maybe it's not. So that's a bit of I suppose, the way into we're not post-Brexit. We're very much still in the consequences of Brexit. Donal is 2 miles from the border. I am about half a mile from the border, living in Strabane, just looking out my window to across the river to the hills that are in Donegal. But Strabane is basically a divided town. Strabane and Lifford, they're sort of the one town, but there's a river that goes through the middle of them, like there are in many towns, except in this one, it happens to be two countries, and there are numerous small towns and villages in Northern Ireland and Ireland that's the same. River through the middle, and depending on which side of the river you're in one country or another. And we still do have all those consequences. Other parts of Europe will have this, where a national border, maybe it's Belgium or Holland, a national border goes through a town, goes through a village, goes through virtually somebody's garden, and you stand on one side of the road, and you're in one country, the other side of the road, you're not. So we're still using different currencies. We still have everything is different. I have moved countries 8 times. I did a quick calculation. I've moved at various times between Northern Ireland and England back to either Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, from there to Sri Lanka, back from Sri Lanka back to Ireland, back to England, back to anyway. I think it's 8 times, and every time you have to do that, you have to get your driving license sorted, you have to get your tax, you have to get your health care, you have to get everything. You have to reinvent yourself every time. So half a mile away, you have to reinvent yourself. Again, everything is different. For our churches in Ireland, for our mainstream churches in Ireland, we have always operated as Ireland is one place. Now, that is not in itself a political statement. It's a pragmatic reality. It could, and our churches, our historic churches, go back pre-1922, when Ireland wasn't a divided island, or not divided in that specific political sense. So we've always been, I'm the Methodist Church in Ireland. We are probably 3/4 in the north, 1/4 in the south, or 2/3, 1/3, something like that. And the district that I'm responsible for is sort of 2/3 in Northern Ireland and 1/3 in the Republic of Ireland. Our ministers move backwards and forwards. We don't make any distinction about that. There are consequences for children's education and spouses' employment and so on, but so be it. Those are the consequences of living in such a part of the world. That membership of the EU and greater European integration had smoothed a lot of those. It hadn't overcome all of them, but it smoothed an awful lot of those. And we're already seeing the wrinkles start to re-emerge again. Recently, there were mission partners coming to work with us from USA. We would ideally have had them working, they're in the city in Derry. Ideally, we've had them doing a fair bit of the work in Donegal. Because of visa reasons, they can't. They can look at it, but they can't work there. We've got another mission partner coming, and because of visa reasons, we have to choose, are they going to be in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland? And that's the only place they will be allowed to work because of visa. Those didn't exist those have been overcome pre-Brexit, but that sort of thing is back with us. So there's I could go through any number of sort of examples of all the practicalities of living in a divided land that EU membership had sort of overcome, Brexit has brought back to us. And bear in mind, in Northern Ireland, we voted to remain, but democracy is, well, democracy is democracy. I think the bit to maybe to try and focus a little bit more on is, for us as Christians, Protestant Christians in Ireland, the Protestant community does not equate with the Unionist community. There is a huge amount of overlap, but the two aren't the same. So I'm not going to call Donal a Northerner and myself a Southerner, but I was born in Mount Mellick. My family roots are in West Cork. So, I do not fit myself neatly into some sort of little Unionist mold, because I'm not. So you can't equate the Catholic Church with, well, they're all nationalists, aren't they? The Protestant churches, well, they're all Unionists, aren't they? Across Ireland, you can't do that. And even within Northern Ireland, you can't do that. It's more complex than that, but there is a huge amount of overlap, an absolutely huge amount of overlap. But you just can't make the assumptions. So it is all about belonging. Where do you belong to? And it's the emotional attachment that Brexit has absolutely shaken. So the customs border in the Irish Sea. What's all that about? It's not about customs. It's not about. One of the marvelous little news items is that in Northern Ireland, we're going to be allowed, because of the Windsor Framework. That's the latest one. Because of that, we are going to be allowed to continue to have higher levels of arsenic in baby food than is legally allowed in the Republic of Ireland. Now, I tell you, that is not a win for unionism, that we could have more arsenic than that lot down south. But that's not, those aren't the issues that it's all about. It's all about, who do you belong to? It's the tribal politics that Donal talked about. We're still stuck in that mindset. And so Brexit, the issue behind Brexit is, did that make it much more likely for there to be a united Ireland? And I think the answer is yes, it did. And the unionists who supported Brexit and voted for Brexit, it was sort of a bit obvious that that was going to be a consequence, but maybe it wasn't just so obvious to all there. But they are now obviously trying to change what they had agreed to, and have yet another go to change it. And whenever we were Bishop Donal and myself were asked to do this, and because of the new framework, I assumed, well, we would be talking about, it would be properly post-Brexit, because by now the unionists would have agreed to it, and so on. If ever there's a community are able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, in my view, it's the unionist politicians, which are different to the unionist people, but it's the unionist politicians in Northern Ireland. So there's a way to be magnanimous, generous, welcoming, accepting, but no, you have to be dragged, sort of virtually screaming and kicking into whatever is the future. So it's about who do you belong to? It's about emotion. So Brexit is it's about belonging for the unionist people, and a lot of those would happen to be members of or connected with Protestant churches in the north. Bear in mind, the huge thing that will change Ireland quicker than anything else is Scottish independence. If Scotland had voted for independence those few years ago, I doubt we'd be having this conversation now. Things would have moved on very rapidly. The unionist would feel most unionists feel a lot of affinity for Scotland. If you're a Presbyterian, you've got all those ties, and Presbyterian is a very strong church in Northern Ireland, and a lot of the unionist cultural traditions are Scottish cultural traditions. So if and when Scotland breaks from the rest of the United Kingdom, that is an absolute crisis moment for the unionist mindset. That would be an interesting time for us. The other issue that I think is not being addressed yet, it's quite a recent one, but we've known it for 20, 30, 40 years. The Protestant community in Northern Ireland is now a minority community. Now, that is not suddenly a great surprise. Donal's absolutely right. Protestant Parliament for Protestant people. That was why Northern Ireland had 6 counties, not the 9 counties that it probably could. Well, it certainly could have had, but it had 6 counties, so that there would be an inbuilt Protestant majority. And the city of Derry was the classic example of gerrymandering, where you had up until into the 70s, you had a unionist majority in the local council, where you did not remotely have a unionist majority if it was simply let's throw all the votes into a bag and count them. But there was a way, and we know that is a very common tactic in various parts of the world. Politics, democracy is always being manipulated. But the Protestant people, if I can speak in any way on behalf of the Protestant people in Northern Ireland, are not at all starting to address what does it mean to be a minority community. For 30, 40 years, the majority of school children in Northern Ireland have been of a Roman Catholic background. For the last 20 plus years, the majority of university students in Northern Ireland have been of a Roman Catholic community background. So the trends are, it's such an obvious thing that this was always going to happen. And those that were the majority would become the minority. And you would think you would act with great generosity when you're the majority, and the hope that that's replicated when you're the minority. That didn't really happen. Although the acceptance of the Good Friday Agreement, even though it was quite a struggle for the unionist people, was a significant act of generosity, because the price of peace is a very high price in our part of the world. The price of war is a horrible price, but the price of peace is also, and had to be, a very high price. We're not unique to paying that price. In most divided parts of the world, the cost of peace is huge, but it is with us. But that idea of the Northern Ireland Protestant as being part of the minority community, that needs to be reflected on an awful lot more as to what that actually means for us and how do we act. And you still get a lot of I think arrogance by church leaders, of which I suppose in a small way I am one. It's only recently I've had to become more actively involved in the Methodist community in the city of Derry. I'm now more hands-on there than I was before. So I now take part in some of our United services, which so far are in the Church of Ireland Cathedral. And they follow the same format. We are led in by no, in fact, let's get it. Well, let's not worry about the who walks in first and so on. But effectively, we are led by the Church of Ireland bishop, in whose home we are very welcome guest, and by Bishop Donal, and then myself and a Presbyterian. We sort of shuffle along behind as well. And you know, I've only done this a few times, so I do smile a little bit at we've outnumbered Donal 3-1, despite the fact that if we were simply to count heads, I think Donal wins that one by a fair margin. There's a generosity in some cases given by the majority to a minority. In other places, it's not given. The Protestant churches in the north of Ireland are now part of the minority community. We have been part of a minority community in the Republic of Ireland ever since the establishment of the state. And in the initial few years of the Irish state, that was a tricky enough experience for those who had always been a minority, and a small minority indeed, but who had in some ways certain privileged positions through British rule, and those all vanished very quickly. But today, there is it's an extremely happy relationship, and maybe indeed more. The Catholic Church in the Republic of Ireland absolutely does not have the dominant voice that it had in previous generations, and indeed the Irish state at times, I think, has gone out of its way to demonstrate that the Catholic Church no longer has a dominant voice in society, perhaps in ways that aren't really necessary to do. So so that experience of being a minority community in the Republic of Ireland gives us a great deal of sort of evidence of welcome, of acceptance, of no threat, and on we go. It's not that it's been a perfect relationship, because it hasn't, and particularly in the 1950s, there was a lot of challenges faced by Protestant communities in the Republic of Ireland. Those days have gone. I mean, that's now 70 years ago. So it's a very good relationship now that gives hope for post-Brexit Northern Ireland, but it does mean there is no quick solution to the issues that we face and that we wrestle with. So we've got all the practical issues of living in on a border that are frankly quite a pain to deal with day by day. You get used to them, but they're frustrating because a lot of them weren't there and a lot of them don't need to be there, but they are there. You've got all the emotional belonging or not belonging, and the fears of the future, even though the evidence from the Republic of Ireland is that your fears of the future are largely unfounded. You've got lack of generosity by some. Maybe that's a defensive mode that would be better without, but anyway, we have it. So my own view is we've got still very difficult years ahead in Northern Ireland. there is the trend of history, the tide of history is sort of a bit obvious. Well, it is to me, but getting to there is going to be very difficult. We have no guarantee that we will not return to days or years of violence, of political violence. We have no guarantee of that. We have got enough either isolated incidents or just ongoing incidents to show that we're not an entirely politically peaceful society. We have got acts of political violence, and we've got the most violent political rhetoric you could ever have the misfortune to hear coming from various sides of our communities. So I think we have got difficult years that still lie ahead. Brexit has made things harder, in my view, and until we get to post-Brexit, it's going to continue to be miserable, and we're paralysed in a political sense. Once we get to post-Brexit, we can then take stock of what it means for the Protestant churches to be part of a minority in Northern Ireland and a minority, of course, throughout Ireland. And that will be an interesting way to be. And I think a little bit like Donal, I look forward to that. I think there's much. Methodists have always been a small minority wherever we've been. You have to go to places like Fiji to find us as a dominant force, and it turns out we're not just quite as cuddly and generous as we'd like to think we would be if we were the dominant religious community in a society. So I'm not holding up Fiji as the example of a Methodist utopia that lies ahead if only we took over the world. But it's. I think for all of us to recognise, we are minority community. That is a much healthier place to be. Christendom, we did not do well under Christendom, even the little Methodist version of Christendom in Fiji. We did not do well. So let's be a lot more humble than we have been in the past, recognise our weaknesses, and maybe if we're able to do that as individual disciples, as church leaders, as church communities, and maybe even political communities, that if we're able to recognize our humility a little bit better, we're able to get a little bit more Christ-like and a little bit of a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. We're now shortly going to break into breakout rooms. Hope people can hear me. And our friends from Churches Together in Britain and Ireland are in the process of organising this. So we'll all be divided into breakout rooms, which we hope to carry on until about 3:30 in breakout rooms, and then resume for a final plenary. Rebecca, have you anything to add?
Just to say that the breakout rooms will not be recorded, but when you come back into the plenary session, that will be recorded, and then eventually that will be put on the website and on YouTube. So just be wary of that. Is Romina here? Can you hear us?
We're slightly early, actually, aren't we?
Yeah.
People have got time for a comfort break if they.
Right. Maybe we could say we could maybe say 2-minute comfort break, and then you'll be put into some groups. So for some breakout discussions of groups of maybe 5 or 6 people, and then we'll see you back in the plenary about past. I think a little pop-up will come and it'll say, are you happy to go into group? And you just click yes.
I think we're all gradually rejoining the main room now.
I may have to go soon because my battery is just about done. So if you lose me, it's because I've run out of electricity.
Thank you, Wilbert, and it's been those of us who are in the same room as you, it's been very good listening to your perspective. Welcome back, everybody. My own technical engagement is slightly limited, so I may occasionally go mute because I can see all of you on one screen, but I'm having to speak into my phone which sees another screen, because it's easier to see you on the big screen, but I can't engage as easily with that. There isn't a formal structure for this final plenary session. It's to give people a chance to bring back things that we've been talking about in the breakout rooms, and we draw things to a close at 4:10. So Rebecca and I will try to identify people who want to speak. It would help if, when you're not speaking, you mute yourself, and also I think you can usually see a raised hand, a proper yellow hand, as opposed to a red hand, if you want to say something rather than just speak. So if you could raise a hand in the ordinary way that you do on Zoom, that would probably help us see whether you want to speak. So who would like to say something first?
Well, because you said what Wilbert was saying in your group was interesting and he might have to disappear, perhaps you could feedback from your group or offer something, Wilbert?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, well, the one thing that I particularly would like to put on record is that faith after Brexit will continue. Faith in Northern Ireland, in a broad sense, is moving forward. And there are all types of faith expressions that, while the numbers in the main churches may be in decline, outside of that, there are lots of faith pockets. So it's I would like to go forward from here that faith is continuing and faith is growing.
Thank you very much. It's good for that, but to see that positive note. Thank you.
Philip.
Following on from that, are the churches and other faith bodies, as it were, mapping out a road plan for the near future, or is the response of the churches and faith bodies largely responsive to local issues or reactive to developments? Is there some kind of, in any quarter, a proactive plan of some kind to how one goes on from here towards whatever happens next in Brexit?
Many of the faith groups, especially the ones I would be involved in, are involved. Their main involvement in community is in social action, food banks, advisory groups, and generally, I think the main energy that the, so we say, unaligned faith groups would have is in trying to follow Jesus' example, love God and love their neighbours as themselves, and that really is the only focus that they're involved in. As regards politics and that sort of thing, some of them find it almost unholy, which is a bit of a disadvantage. But the newer and more modern faith groups are socially active, and looking after the poor, looking after the disadvantaged, and the politics is not something that they really concern themselves with too much.
Nicola,
Sorry, trying to unmute there. Yes, so it is the Irish Council of Churches and the Irish Interchurch meeting. They have a strategy. It's called the Unfinished Work of Peace, and they're working to connect the different levels of engagement, ecumenical engagement primarily across the member churches. So trying to strengthen the connection between the work that's being done at local community level, whether that's anti-poverty community development work that addresses some of the consequences of violent conflict, right up to the high level meetings that are being taken by senior leadership of the churches, and recognizing that in between that there's a lot of work that goes on that could be described as quiet diplomacy, and trying to draw together the insights that are coming from those different areas of engagement. So in CTBI, we've been working to support that from a wider British and Irish perspective. And last November, we brought over representatives of the national bodies from Scotland and Wales, and one of our staff members who work in the area of anti-racism, speaking out of an English perspective primarily, to support a group of people, clergy and lay leaders from different denominations who are working at some of the hard edge of the peace building work. And we met up in Dublin and learned from their experience, talked about how we could support them, the importance of engaging across the different jurisdictions on these islands, building those relationships within churches and also in the wider civic context. And we were able to get former Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern to come along, speak to them, give them a bit of a motivational talk about what the contribution of faith leaders could continue to be in this space, and also to get his perspective from the work that he's been involved in around the post-Brexit, or as we're working towards a post-Brexit situation with the negotiations, and looking at the fallout in terms of the peace process, and considering where we are, particularly in relation to the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement this year. So that's work that we're committed to continuing over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Any other points people would like to make at this stage?
Could I ask
Yep.
if Gillian might offer some further reflection, because she made the point that more of a kind of a Southern Ireland perspective may be useful.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, I for those who weren't in my group, I'm Gillian Kingston. I'm from the Methodist Church in Ireland, like Dr. Skuce is, and I too come from West Cork. So yes, when Brexit happened, I think we were all rather shocked. And I think there was some feeling of disillusionment in the Republic of Ireland, because we felt that on the whole, the population of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland had not considered that the only land border there would be between the United Kingdom and the European Union was actually on our small island. And the complications that both Nicola and Stephen have referred to coming from that set of affairs. We are in the Republic of Ireland proud Europeans. We have contributed to Europe, and Europe has certainly contributed to us. And it has benefited us. There is no question of doubt about that. It is problematic on this island. When I go up to Belfast to the headquarters of the Methodist Church in Ireland, I have to cross the border. As has been pointed out, I have to use a different currency. And if I was up there for too long, I think they'd probably question my car license, or my license to drive, not to mention my car taxation. It's very complicated. As I was saying to the group I was in, on the day that the voting on Brexit came out, I happened to be at a party in Kent, which sounds very grand. But I was sitting between somebody who was a colonel in the British Army and a former British ambassador to the Republic of Ireland. And the Colonel was absolutely delighted that the vote had gone the way it is. We should never have gone into the blankety-blankety thing in the first place, was his kind of response. The former ambassador, who I say will remain nameless, was nearly in tears. He said, "It is the worst day of my life." And he had been instrumental in putting together one of the people putting together the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement. And he said, "I can see this unraveling. There are going to be untold consequences and unintended consequences of this whole thing." And of course, he was right. So I don't know if that answers the query you're asking, Rebecca, but that's where we are down here.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a very, very good point. Thank you.
Philip?
Philip, yes.
You're muted, Philip.
Yes, Nicola, you spoke about the ecumenical aspect of the work of the churches. Is there an interfaith aspect? I mean, I'm not clear about how many, for example, Muslims and Jews there are in the island of Ireland, and are they involved in any active way?
Yes, I can respond to that. So we have a number of structures for interfaith engagement that operate in slightly different ways, but all I think make a very important contribution. So we have the Dublin City Interfaith Forum, which does a lot of work in and around Dublin, but not limited to Dublin in scope. And it's a really important forum for relationship building between the different faiths, and they do a lot of the liaison with the Irish government, particularly around dialogue with the faith sector. And then in Northern Ireland context, we have the Northern Ireland Interfaith Forum, and it does a lot of relationship building work and creating the space for the representatives of the different faiths to get to know each other. And then in terms of liaison with government, there's a Community Faiths Forum that is supported by the Department for Communities in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and it has a particular focus on social action, social outreach, and creating a space for dialogue between government and the faith sector around issues impacting communities. And then the Irish government uses the EU's Article 17 model for a formal structured dialogue with the wider faith sector. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of relationship building, and particularly giving other faiths other than Christian their due space in those conversations. They would still, in both jurisdictions, feel quite marginalized. They would feel that the language is predominantly oriented towards a Christian view of faith in society, and very often excludes them in references to churches as the expression of kind of local faith communities to the exclusion of others. But there was some very positive work during the pandemic when those dialogues became much more regular, and you saw faith communities as they were working together around the public health protections that needed to be in place, developing a better understanding of each other, how we all work, how we worship, and recognizing that there's much more that unites than divides. So I think during the pandemic, there's a positive contribution to take those relationships forward.
Thank you very much. Grace, Davy had her hand up. Grace, welcome. Grace, welcome. You had your hand up. Yes, Grace, you're mute.
I've done it. I was very struck by what Gillian said. Excuse me for going back to that, Nicola. For how many people do you speak in this really strong anger about Brexit? I mean, if I mix in certain circles in this country, I can find echoes of that. But it's not universal. I know that. You can get into trouble sometimes. In the Republic of Ireland, do you really speak for the majority, or is it? Would you be more cautious in certain circles than in others, in what you said?
No, I don't think I'd be more cautious in certain circles than others, but I was asked a personal question, so I sort of responded to it in a personal way. But I do think a lot of people, many people, of course, in the Republic of Ireland, a huge majority, I would say, have relations and friends living in Britain, but also in Northern Ireland, and they have connections with that part of the world. I think that a lot of people felt that the maths was all wrong, that, you know, when the vote was taken those years ago, only 66% of the population of the United Kingdom voted, apparently, and of that 66%, only 52 voted in favour. So it was, you know, the UK came out on a minority of people, if you like, but of course, those people don't vote, their voice can't be heard. But I imagine most people are a bit cheesed off with Brexit, yes, but how angry they would be, I couldn't tell you. And I don't purport to speak for anyone but myself.
No, I mean, you expressed an opinion which I share, to be honest, but I just wondered whether it was, you know, a very much a majority opinion in the Republic of Ireland, whereas here, I think it probably is a majority now, but a small one.
I imagine if most people in Ireland aren't thinking terribly much of Brexit, unless you live in the border counties and have to go backwards and forwards between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland on a regular basis, as, for example, Stephen does and Nicola does to a certain extent. But for those of us further south, unless we're looking for certain things which might be imported via Britain, then it doesn't impact us.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a small thing on that? I think I read a few months ago in the papers that for the first time last year, there were more people in Northern Ireland applied for an Irish passport, which they're entitled to get, than applied for a UK passport. Not necessarily because they feel Irish, but because they feel European.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
Which is completely absent in this country, I think. I think that's a very perceptive comment. Very, very few people in England feel, English people feel European. I mean, probably we collectively are exceptions. But I think that's a very interesting observation that in Ireland, that reaction is a different one.
I can remember speaking with a bishop of the Church of England who said to me, "Oh, Gillian, I do wish I had an Irish grandparent." I wasn't able to help him in that matter.
Yes, the only good thing that's happened to me since Brexit is that because of my late unionist Presbyterian father, I got an Irish passport a few months after Brexit, which I treasure.
What an irony.
And so is my sister, yes. Any other comments?
Yeah.
Yeah, David Blackman, yes.
Yes. To what extent has the feeling in Ireland changed as the whole social political atmosphere in the Republic has changed over the years? I'm asking our clergy speakers, but also Gillian, who lives in the South, perhaps. To what extent is one, I mean, the fact that Brits are desperately looking for enough Irish ancestry to get an Irish passport? That's fascinating to her. But just generally, the feeling is that residents in the north of the island are less worried about the prospect of a united Ireland because of all the changes that has happened in the Republic. That's a general question. I'd be interested to hear from our clergy speakers, also from Gillian on that, and anybody else resident, and also the residents who are taking part, who live in the north. To what extent has the whole situation changed in the last 20, 30 years?
Well, David, I'm not sure that I'm competent to answer that, and I think I would want to bat that over towards Stephen.
Yes, okay, Mark.
Yeah, I think there have been huge changes in the Republic of Ireland in the last 30, 40 years. And I think there would be a swathe of the Northern Ireland Unionist population would be, to say less fearful. I don't know how many people were ever fearful about living in the Republic of Ireland or living in a united Ireland. It's just all the practical things. To me, it's an emotional thing. So there have been changes. Ireland has become a much more liberal and secular and European society over the last 30, 40 years. Those are, to a lot of people, those are very attractive attributes. Even the secular one, for we're all people of faith here, I imagine we are. To be honest, living in a secular society compared to a religiously dominated society, give me a secular society any day of the week. So I think those are all positive developments that make the Republic of Ireland attractive to anyone, and that would include the Unionist in the north, or a bit more attractive to the Unionist in the north. But as I tried to say earlier, a lot of it is simply an emotional response. You feel British or you feel Irish, and you don't really care. If you feel British, nothing's going to make you unfeel that, except Britain disintegrates, which the Scottish independence thing would do. So you're actually less worried about, well, you are worried about your child at school, or your granny is worried about the child at school. You're less worried about some of the practical details, because wherever you move, there are differences in legislation and laws that allow one thing, make it harder to do something else. That's just life. But yeah, the Republic of Ireland, because it's more liberal and secular and European, is a more attractive country today, and wealthy. I should absolutely bung in wealthy, because in the 1980s it was far from wealthy. Today, one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. So frankly, I mean, I live half a mile from the Republic of Ireland. In the privacy of this room, there's no debate which side of the border I would have chosen to live on if I'd had a choice. In the Methodist system, you don't get a choice.
I wonder if you could measure next Saturday how many people on the northern part of this island are cheering for England when it comes to the rugby at Aviva Stadium in Dublin.
It's a very good point. Thank you. Yes, that's interesting. Are there any other hands that I can't see? Could I perhaps ask our two speakers just to conclude our time together with a few concluding remarks? I know you both said a great deal. It's been very good having you both with us. It's really been a tremendous exercise. But could I ask Bishop Donal and Stephen to perhaps make some concluding remarks at this stage? Bishop Donal.
Thank you very much for the opportunity just to have the conversation with you. I think Stephen put his finger on something. I hope it's come across quite clearly. We're stuck between the sense of the Good Friday Agreement making us both Irish and British, and finding a way of living together with diversity and celebrating it rather than fearing it, and the reality of Brexit. I think certainly people near the border, whether Stephen or myself or any of the others, certainly are quite clear there will be no hard border on the island of Ireland. Politicians find some way of playing with that. That's your problem, not ours. We have got used, certainly post-Good Friday Agreement, to a remarkable degree of stability here, and we're not going to go back to the past and to divisions. I said in that conference with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung some months ago, it may in history mean we look back on Brexit and realise that membership of the EU was the one thing that held the UK together rather than being its enemy.
Thank you very much, Bishop, and thank you for being with us. Stephen.
I look back to my childhood and didn't enjoy it. because I grew up, like everyone of my generation, in a conflict situation, and to some extent in a conflict zone. And my great fear is that there's a generation that doesn't remember that. And our politicians are very quick to use a lot of emotional and violent rhetoric. And Brexit, we're still doing that. Almost every day of the week. You hear the aggressive language and the refusal to sit in a local assembly or parliament with those with whom you disagree. The refusal to sit there creates a vacuum that has to be filled by something or someone. And we know horribly in our history what has normally filled the vacuum in Northern Ireland. So I'm not despondent, but I'm not personally fearful, but I think we have got a number of still very difficult years ahead of us that have been, to some extent, caused by Brexit, or perhaps Brexit has pushed it, been the trigger for it. It was sort of always there. And if and when we do get over that, we have then come a long, long way along the journey. But we can't guarantee we get over it. It's not, history does not always just go in one direction unbroken. So I personally value your prayers and your interest in our part of the world, because I think, unfortunately, we will still make the news for the next few years.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you too for being with us. I hope I speak for all of us when I say that we've learned a great deal this afternoon, both from our two very distinguished and eloquent speakers and from each other from different backgrounds. And I hope that you found this valuable and rewarding. I'd just like to thank Rebecca for all her hard work in setting up this, and the staff from CTBI for all their technical support. Those of you who are involved in Faith in Europe will know about our future dates, and I hope you'll be able to join us there. But I'd just like to thank you all for being with us, to wish you a very good rest of Lent and a very good Easter. Take care, everybody, and God bless.